The gun, oil, and leather scent of the saddle shop had become Harrison Cole's entire world since the day he buried his wife and infant daughter 3 years ago in the frozen ground of Fort Laramie, Wyoming. He was 28 years old, but the lines around his eyes belonged to a man twice his age, and nobody in town could remember the last time they had seen him smile. The winter of 1878 had settled over Wyoming territory with a vengeance, turning the rooted streets into frozen rivers of mud and forcing most folks to huddle near their stoves. Harrison worked from dawn until well past dark, his callous hands crafting saddles and tack with a precision that bordered on obsessive. The work kept his mind occupied, kept the memories at bay, kept him from having to think about the empty house that waited for him each night. His younger brother Samuel had tried to coax him back to life countless times, inviting him to dinners and dances, but Harrison always refused with a curt shake of his head and returned to his leather and tools. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning when the temperature had dropped so low that breath crystallized the moment it left a person's mouth. Marshal Tom Riss burst through the door of Harrison's shop, bringing with him a blast of frigid air and an expression of pure bewilderment. "Harrison, we have got a situation," Tom announced, stamping his feet on the wooden floor to shake off the snow. "That mail-order bride your brother sent away for just arrived on the morning stage." Harrison looked up from the saddle he was stitching, his dark eyes narrowing in confusion. "My brother did not send away for any mail-order bride. Samuel is not even looking to get married." Tom cleared his throat and pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Well, according to this letter she is carrying somebody using your name and address." "Most certainly did. She came all the way from Boston, and she is standing out in the cold right now with 3 trunks in a bird cage." The leather needles slipped from Harrison's fingers and clattered onto the workbench. Ice flooded through his veins as understanding dawned. Samuel, his well-meaning, interfering, absolutely infuriating younger brother had done this. For months, Samuel had been harping about how Harrison needed to move on, needed to live again, needed to open his heart. Apparently, Samuel had decided to take matters into his own hands. "I did not send for any bride," Harrison said flatly, rising to his feet. "Tell her there has been a mistake. Give her money for the return trip." "You tell her," Tom said, his weathered face creasing with sympathy. "I am not about to break that poor girl's heart. She has been traveling for near 3 weeks to get here." Harrison grabbed his heavy coat from the peg by the door and shoved his arms through the sleeves with more force than necessary. His jaw was set so tight it ached as he followed Tom out into the bitter cold. The main street of Fort Laramie was nearly deserted with only a few hardy souls braving the weather. The stagecoach sat in front of the general store, its horses stamping and snorting clouds of steam into the frozen air, and there she stood. She was the most ill-prepared person Harrison had ever seen for Wyoming winter. She wore a thin traveling dress in pale blue, completely inappropriate for the weather, and her coat looked like it might have been suitable for a Boston autumn, but was absolutely useless against the Wyoming cold. She was shivering so violently that Harrison could see it from 20 feet away. A ridiculous hat sat askew on her head, decorated with what might have once been flowers, but now looked like frozen debris. At her feet sat 3 large trunks and inexplicably a bird cage covered with a cloth. As Harrison approached, she turned toward him and he got his first clear look at her face. She was young, probably around 23 or 24, with delicate features and large eyes that looked far too hopeful for someone who was about to have her entire world upended. Her lips were tinged blue from the cold, and her teeth were chattering so hard he could hear them clicking together. "Are you Mr. Harrison Cole?" she asked, her voice shaking from both cold and nerves. She attempted what was probably meant to be a graceful step toward him, but her frozen skirts tangled around her legs, and she stumbled forward directly into a water trough that had frozen solid overnight. The impact sent her sprawling across the ice-covered trough with a yelp of surprise. Her hat flew off, releasing a cascade of dark hair from its pins. The bird cage toppled over, and from beneath the cloth came a series of indignant squawks. One of her trunks fell open, spilling ladies' undergarments across the frozen ground. She lay there spread-eagled on the ice trough, her skirts hiked up to reveal sensible boots and several layers of petticoats. Looking absolutely mortified for a moment, Harrison could only stare. Then something happened that he had not experienced in 3 long years. It started as a pressure in his chest moved up through his throat, and before he could stop it, a laugh burst from his lips. Not a small chuckle or a polite snort, but a genuine full-bodied laugh that seemed to surprise him as much as it did everyone else on the street. The woman on the ice trough turned even redder. If that was possible, given how cold she was. This is not how I imagined our first meeting, she said with as much dignity as someone sprawled on a frozen water trough could muster. Harrison quickly sobered, remembering the situation, but his face still felt strange from the unfamiliar expression. He stepped forward and offered his hand to help her up. "Miss, there has been a terrible mistake." She grasped his hand with her own frozen fingers and allowed him to pull her upright. She was shorter than he had thought, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. Up close, he could see that her eyes were an unusual shade of green, like new grass in spring, and they were starting to shimmer with unshed tears as the reality of his words sank in. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did not send for a mail-order bride," Harrison said as gently as he could manage. "I believe my brother may have done this without my knowledge or consent. I am very sorry you came all this way, but I cannot marry you." The tears spilled over then, tracking down her frozen cheeks. She pulled her hand from his and wrapped her arms around herself. "I see. Of course, I should have known it was too good to be true. The letters were so kind, so thoughtful. I suppose I was foolish to believe someone actually wanted me." Something twisted in Harrison's chest at those words, but he pushed it aside. "I will pay for your return trip to Boston. The next stage east leaves in 3 days once this cold spell breaks." "I cannot go back to Boston," she said quietly, bending to gather the scattered undergarments with shaking hands. "There is nothing for me there anymore." Tom stepped forward, his marshal's instincts clearly wearing with his sense of compassion. "Miss, maybe you should explain your situation. What is your name?" "Daisy Jennings," she said, shoving lace-trimmed drawers into the trunk with complete disregard for folding. "I was a governess in Boston until my employer decided I was too much of a temptation for her husband. Never mind that the man could not keep his hands to himself, and I never encouraged him in the slightest. She dismissed me without a reference, and spread rumors that ensured I could not find another position. I used the last of my savings to come here. I have exactly $7.32 to my name, no family, and no prospects." She said all of this matter-of-factly while continuing to stuff items into her trunk, but Harrison could see the way her hands trembled, and he suspected it was not entirely from the cold. The bird in the cage was still squawking indignantly, adding a surreal quality to the entire scene. "What is with the bird?" Harrison found himself asking, though it was hardly the most important question at hand. "That is Penelope," Daisy said as if that explained everything. "She is a parrot. She was my mother's. She is all I have left of my family." "Damnation." The bird shrieked from under its cover, making Daisy wse. "She has picked up some unfortunate vocabulary from the sailors on the ship," Daisy said apologetically. "I am working on correcting it." Harrison dragged a hand down his face, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. This was Samuel's fault. All of it. His brother had created this disaster. And now this poor woman was stranded in Wyoming territory in the middle of winter with no money, no prospects, and a cursing parrot. "You cannot stay out here in this cold," Tom said, ever practical. "You will freeze to death." "Harrison, your house has room." "Absolutely not," Harrison said immediately. "That would be completely inappropriate." "Then what do you suggest?" Tom pressed. "The boarding house is full up with railroad surveyors. Your brother has that extra room above his barber shop." Samuel Harrison bit out the name like a curse. Is the last person who should be involved in this situation, seeing as how he created it. Daisy had managed to repack her trunk and was attempting to lift it despite clearly lacking the strength to do so. Her face was so pale now that Harrison worried she might actually faint. He could not remember the last time he had seen someone so thoroughly unprepared for Wyoming winter. She was going to die of exposure if someone did not intervene. And despite his anger at the situation, he could not have that on his conscience. "Fine," he heard himself say, "she can stay in my spare room until we figure something out, but this is temporary, Miss Jennings. Just until the stage runs again, and you can go somewhere more suitable." Daisy stopped struggling with the trunk and looked up at him with those enormous green eyes. "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Cole. I promise I will not be any trouble." Even as she said it, she took a step backward and collided with the bird cage, sending it sliding across the icy ground. The cloth flew off, revealing an indignant green parrot with a bright red head, who immediately began screeching every curse word in her considerable vocabulary at the top of her lungs. Several passing townsfolk stopped to stare, and Harrison could already imagine the gossip that would be flying through Fort Laramie by nightfall. He gathered Daisy's trunks with ease that spoke of years of physical labor and jerked his head toward the end of the street. "My house is this way. Can you manage the bird?" "Yes, of course." Daisy scooped up the cage, cooing apologies to Penelope, and hurried after him as quickly as her frozen skirts would allow. Harrison's house sat at the edge of town, a sturdy two-story structure he had built with his own hands during the first year of his marriage. He had added every detail with care, thinking about the family he and Margaret would raise there, the life they would build. Now it stood as a monument to all he had lost, and he spent as little time there as possible. He kicked open the front door and deposited the trunks in the entryway. The house was cold since he rarely bothered to keep more than a small fire going and his breath fogged in the air. Daisy followed him inside, still shivering violently, and set Penelope's cage on a small table. "I will get a fire going," Harrison said, already moving toward the fireplace in the main room. "There are blankets in the chest upstairs. The spare room is the second door on the right." "Mr. Cold," Daisy began, but he cut her off. "We can talk after you warm up. You are half frozen. Get out of those wet clothes and wrap yourself in something warm." She nodded and made her way carefully up the stairs, leaving small puddles from her frozen skirts as she went. Harrison focused on building up the fire, coaxing the flames to life with practiced efficiency. Once heat began radiating from the fireplace, he went to the kitchen and set water to boil for tea. The domestic tasks felt strange after so long. He usually just ate cold meals and drank coffee, not bothering with anything more elaborate. It was a good 20 minutes before Daisy reappeared, wrapped in what looked like 3 quilts and with her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders as it dried. Her face had regained some color, though her eyes were still red-rimmed. She had clearly been crying upstairs. "Sit by the fire," Harrison said, gesturing to one of the chairs he rarely used. "I made tea." "You did not have to do that," she said softly. But she took the offered chair gratefully and accepted the steaming cup he handed her. She wrapped her fingers around it, absorbing the warmth. Harrison took the other chair, maintaining a respectful distance. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, awkwardness settled over them like a heavy blanket. He had not been alone in a room with a woman since Margaret died. He had not wanted to be. "I truly am sorry about the confusion," Daisy said finally. "The letters I received were so detailed. They talked about life in Wyoming, about the ranch and the horses, about wanting to start fresh but not wanting to do it alone. I thought I was entering into an agreement with someone who genuinely wanted a partner." "My brother wrote those letters," Harrison said heavily. "Samuel owns the barber shop in town. He has been after me for months to move on with my life. I suppose he thought this was the solution." "Move on from what?" Daisy asked, then immediately looked mortified. "I apologize. That is none of my business." Harrison stared into the fire for a long moment, debating whether to answer. He never talked about Margaret and the baby. Never. But something about this strange, clumsy woman who had traveled across the country based on lies made him feel like he owed her some explanation. "My wife and daughter died 3 years ago," he said quietly. "Margaret died in childbirth, and the baby only lived a few hours. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like someone else's life entirely. I am so sorry," Daisy whispered, and the genuine sympathy in her voice made Harrison's throat tighten. "It is what it is," he said roughly. "Samuel thinks I need to move on, find someone new, start over. He does not understand that I am not interested in replacing what I lost." "That is why you have not smiled in so long," Daisy said. It was not a question. Harrison looked at her sharply. "How would you know anything about that?" She had the grace to look embarrassed. "When you laughed earlier after I fell, the marshal looked like he had seen a ghost, and several people on the street actually stopped and stared. It seemed clear that seeing you laugh was unusual." "I have not had much cause for laughter," Harrison said. "I imagine not." Daisy took a sip of her tea, then added quietly. "Though I suppose it is rather ironic that my complete humiliation was the thing to make you break your streak. I assure you that falling over frozen water troughs is not a regular habit of mine. Falling over other things, perhaps, but not usually water troughs." Despite himself, Harrison felt his lips twitch. "You admit to being clumsy then?" "Oh, terribly," Daisy said with a weak smile. "My mother used to say I could trip over my own shadow. I knocked over 3 vases and a grandfather clock in my last employer's home. Though in my defense, the grandfather clock was already unstable." "That is quite a record," Harrison said dryly. I do try, Daisy replied. And this time her smile was a bit stronger. They fell into silence again, but it was slightly less uncomfortable now. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the house, and reminding them both that winter in Wyoming was not to be trifled with. What will you do? Harrison asked finally. If you truly cannot return to Boston, Daisy set down her teacup and pulled the quilts tighter around herself. I honestly do not know. I suppose I should look for employment, but I have no idea what opportunities might exist in a place like Fort Laramie. I am educated and can teach, but I doubt there is much call for governesses on the frontier. There is a school, Harrison said slowly. The teacher is a widow named Mrs. Patterson. She might know of families needing help with children. And Sarah Chen, who runs the general store, is always looking for help, especially during the busy season. That is kind of you to think of, Daisy said. I will inquire tomorrow if the weather permits. You should stay inside until the cold breaks. Harrison said, you are not equipped for this weather. In the morning, I will see about getting you some proper winter clothes. You cannot walk around town in those thin dresses. I cannot accept more charity, Daisy protested. You have already done more than enough. It is not charity, it is practicality, Harrison countered. If you are going to be here even temporarily, you need appropriate clothing. Consider it payment for the entertainment value of watching you fall on that water trough. Daisy's face flushed pink. You are never going to let me forget that, are you? Probably not, Harrison said, and was surprised to find himself almost smiling again. What was happening to him from her cage? Penelope chose that moment to shriek hell and damnation at the top of her lungs, making them both jump. I really am working on her vocabulary, Daisy said apologetically. Right, Harrison said, I can see you are making excellent progress. They talked a bit more as the afternoon wore on, carefully avoiding any topics too personal or painful. Harrison learned that Daisy was 24 years old, had grown up in Boston, and had been supporting herself as a governess since her parents died 5 years earlier. She had a quick wit when she was not devastated by having her marriage prospects literally fall through. And despite himself, Harrison found her easy to talk to in a way he had not experienced in years. As evening approached, Harrison excused himself to go speak with his brother. The cold had not abated, but his fury kept him plenty warm as he stalked through the frozen streets toward Samuel's barber shop. He found his younger brother just closing up for the day, and the guilty expression on Samuel's face when he saw Harrison confirmed everything. Before you say anything, Samuel began, holding up his hands, I want you to know that I did this because I love you and I am worried about you. Harrison grabbed Samuel by his coat front and slammed him against the wall hard enough to rattle the bottles on the shelves. You had no right at all, Samuel. You are killing yourself. Samuel shot back, not bothering to struggle against his brother's grip. You spend every waking moment working. You do not eat properly. You do not sleep. You do not talk to anyone. It has been 3 years, Harrison. Margaret would not have wanted this for you. Do not, Harrison said through clenched teeth, presume to tell me what my wife would have wanted. You barely knew her. I knew her well enough to know she loved you and would be heartbroken to see what you have become. Samuel said, you are my brother and you are disappearing right in front of me. I had to do something. Harrison released Samuel and stepped back, his hands shaking with anger and something else he did not want to name. So, you arranged a marriage. You forged letters and made promises in my name to a woman who has now traveled across the country for nothing. I hope that maybe once she got here, once you met her, you might see that life could still hold something good, Samuel said quietly. I know it was wrong. I know I overstepped, but I was desperate, Harrison. I miss my brother, the real you, not this ghost who goes through the motions of living. Some of the fury drained out of Harrison at the raw emotion in Samuel's voice. His brother was 25, only 3 years younger, but sometimes the gap felt much wider. Samuel had always been the optimistic one, the one who saw possibility where others saw only obstacles. It was one of the things Harrison had always loved about him, even when it was infuriating. You cannot fix this with schemes and tricks, Harrison said wearily. Grief does not work that way. I know, Samuel said, but maybe friendship could. Maybe just having someone else in that empty house could help. I am not saying you have to marry her, but would it be so terrible to have some company? To remember what it is like to connect with another person. Harrison thought about Daisy sitting by his fire, wrapped in quilts, talking about her clumsy tendencies with self-deprecating humor. He thought about how he had laughed for the first time in 3 years at the sight of her sprawled across that water trough. He thought about the fleeting moment when the constant ache in his chest had eased just slightly. "She needs a place to stay until she can find work," Harrison said finally. "That is all this is. She is stranded here because of your actions. So the least I can do is make sure she does not freeze or starve." "Of course," Samuel agreed quickly, though Harrison could see the spark of hope in his brother's eyes that made him want